Hello, welcome. It's been a while since I last did a video, and being as we're halfway through our second lockdown in England, I thought I would do a quick overview of what's been going on recently, how the three-tier system may have had an effect, and I'm going to start off talking through a bit of theory so we can interpret the results. So if you want to look at it later, you can look at the Wikipedia page, which describes the SIR model. And I've basically taken the differential equations from this page and put them into Excel so that I can talk you through these visually. So there's basically three main parameters for the SIR model. You've got a population size, I've said is 1,000 people. You have what's known as a transmission rate that relates to the R value, and you have a recovery rate which relates to how quickly people are unwell or infectious. So in the SIR model, you start off with everyone being susceptible. There's 1,000 of those, and over time, let's call this week 1, 2, 3, etc., number of people becoming infectious. That will come to a peak at some point in the future and then start to drop off. While that's happening, people are going on to be classed as recovered, which is the grey line. That will increase until you get to the entire population once they've all been infected at some point. And the number of susceptible people will be declining over time. So if you take these same bits of data and you plot it to show the number of daily infections, you end up with a curve which will increase rapidly, come to a point where you could say that the population has reached herd immunity, and that will drop off over time until there's basically no one else being infected day on day. Just out of interest, I've plotted an exponential curve in blue, just so as you can see that early in the epidemic, the number of daily infections can actually be modelled with an exponential curve. Once they start to diverge, it becomes a bit more complicated, but it's worth understanding that early on they will basically have the same trajectory, and that's useful to understand later. So I've taken this very same model and I've illustrated what happens if you change the transmission rate after week 6, for example. And that's effectively the same as changing the R number, reducing it from, say, 1.4 to 1.2. And what you see is you see a drop in the number of daily infections, where if you were looking at this day on day over these few weeks, you may think you've reached a peak and you're in decline. The reality is, because R is still greater than 1, it will start taking off again and it will increase to the natural peak, which will be lower than the previous peak, and then drop off. Comparing these two models side by side, what we can see is that the original model had a peak of about 600 people being infectious at one time, whereas the second model only had a peak just over 300, so it was about half the number of people infectious, and also you could probably say it would be half the number of people in hospital. The peak in daily infections was about 200 in the original model, and then that dropped to about 60, 70 people, which is about a third in the second model. The biggest takeaway, I think, from this, apart from seeing the obvious evidence of flattening the curve, so to speak, is that when the R number reduces from one value to another, say 1.4 to 1.2, you will see that the number of daily infections, daily hospitalisations and daily deaths will drop over a period of a week or so. But if R isn't less than 1, then it will continue to rise again up until its natural peak before it drops off again. So government dashboard is a good place to look at for a quick glance. We can see that it was increasing over time, started to flatten off and then started to rise again. And this is analogous to what I was just talking through, where if the R number is reduced but is still above 1, you will see it either dip or flatten off, and then it will start to increase. If you look at the daily deaths, then you can see that that appears to be flattening off, but really that's trailing behind the hospitals. So that will also curve up in the next few days, or next week perhaps, I'd expect. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to the NHS data because it's more up to date than the government dashboard. It's about 2 days more up to date. So I'm going to take the daily hospital admissions and bed occupancy data. This is something I used in a previous video, and I'm going to quickly walk you through the different regions and how they're looking in comparison to each other and how the tier system seems to have affected things. So the spreadsheet from the NHS contains all of the regions in the England, which is 7 different regions, and it goes from August through to the current date. So what I've done, I've taken a copy of that data, I've calculated a 7-day moving average over the top, taken the population sizes, those are from the ONS website, and then I've converted the number of daily hospital admissions to the daily number of admissions per 1 million people. So when you put that all together on one graph, you can basically compare all of the regions fairly. So all 7 regions here are on one graph. I've put some dotted lines to indicate some dates of note for England as a whole. So 14th of October is when the tier system was introduced. Up to 7 days later, you would definitely not expect to see any change in the hospitalisations due to the tier system. I've also noted the date of the lockdown, lockdown 2, which was 4th of November. And again, I've put 7 days later where you wouldn't expect the lockdown itself to be affecting admissions during that time period. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to look at the regions based on the prevalence and number of hospital admissions on a daily basis. So I've got the east of England, which is in the orangey colour, got London in grey, south east in blue, and southwest in the burgundy or brown colour. So what we can see is that all of these regions, with the exception of London, have been increasing over time. If we look at the tier system being introduced at the 14th of October, we can see subsequently they've all continued to rise. They've all been in tier 1, and there's only been a minor kind of undulation to these curves. London's the exception. London, after the tier was introduced, they went straight into tier 2. We did see that about 12 days later they started to flatten off in terms of the number of daily hospitalisations. That's dropped off a bit, and then it started to raise again, and it's rising quite quickly. So that brings me back to the theory I was talking through, which is if you drop the R number from, say, 1.4 to 1.2, then you will see a dip in the number of daily infections, daily hospitalisations, followed by a rise. And I'm pretty confident on this data. That's basically what happened in London. There was a bit of respite whereby the number of infections, number of hospitalisations dropped off, but that started to rise again. And then to the right of the final dotted line, we may start to see the effects of a lockdown over the next few days. So if we look at the areas of higher prevalence, we've got the Midlands in yellow, we've got northeast in blue, and we've got northwest in green. So the green is obviously the northwest dropping off, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The Midlands has continued to rise throughout this period. There have been some kind of levelling off or flattening off and then rising again. That may be the introduction of tier 2 limits in some of the areas. Likewise, in the northeast as well, we can see that the gradient definitely eased up a bit for a while, around about a fortnight after the tier restrictions were put into place, but subsequently started to rise again. The northwest in green is basically the one area where you do see a very discernible drop in the number of cases, number of hospitalisations. And this was apparent from about 12 days after the tier system being introduced in Liverpool. So that caused a drop in the number of daily hospitalisations, but there was a sign of that flattening off and maybe even starting to rise again, even beyond when the second lockdown was implemented. There were other areas in the northwest that went into tier 3 prior to the lockdown, so those might account for this little curve there. So just in conclusion of those different areas, it seems to me that tier 1 has almost no effect, as we're hearing by the representatives of the NHS on the number of hospitalisations. Tier 2 seems to have a temporary effect, and then the cases start to rise again. Tier 3 seems to potentially get a grasp of the situation and start to reduce the numbers, but it seems to need to affect a lot of the areas to bring that number down. So an interesting thing to do with all of these regions is to see that they basically follow the same trajectory. So if we look at the high prevalence areas, the Midlands, northeast and northwest, and then we overlay one other area, the southwest, but we shift them all so that their epidemics basically have the same starting point, you can see that the growth from kind of middle of August, as it is on this key, right through to the middle of October, so a period of 2 months, they basically follow exactly the same trajectory. So bearing in mind that all of the regions seem to follow roughly the same trajectory, it begs the question what's going to happen when we come out of lockdown. Now if we look at a week into lockdown for the southwest, we can see that it's roughly about where the Midlands were 2 weeks earlier. It's about 3 weeks behind where the northeast was, and it's about 4 weeks behind where the northwest was. So wherever that will reduce down to after lockdown, it will inevitably just start to climb again and on the same trajectory. if we go back into tier 1. I would be very surprised if the government do choose to put anywhere in the country back into tier 1, sadly, because it's clear from the data that we've been looking at, especially when we look at all of these different graphs, that tier 1 doesn't have a major impact, and it certainly doesn't get a grip of the situation. Tier 2 arguably is also a little bit too light, because London, although it had a respite for a time, it did then start to climb again. I suspect that we'll see a widespread implementation of tier 2 like measures, which is not visiting people in each other's houses. I suspect they will also extend the tier 3 restrictions to further areas. I wouldn't like to guess what they will do, but I suspect that's what they will be doing. So I think takeaway from this video, if we have a quick look at the theoretical graph again, it's kind of indisputable that if the R number drops, then the number of cases and the number of hospitalisations will also drop. Just bear in mind, when you're looking at it day on day over the period of a week or two, you may see what looks like a peak and then a drop, when in reality the R is still above 1 and it's going to carry on rising. So just bear that in mind when you're looking at numbers. So hopefully that was interesting. If you did like the video, please press like. If you are interested in future videos, please subscribe to the channel. Hope to speak to you again. Bye.